My name is Aviva Goldberg. We've actually met before, Rabbi Chayton, and I am very pleased and honored to be involved here this evening for us, on this 9 Adar webinar. I want to just say a few words about why this is so important to us at Pardes, at the Pardes Center for Jewish Educators, and why we really believe that day school should be involved in this entire campaign. First of all, the whole idea of Mahloket mattering. Our belief at Pardes is that people don't exist in a vacuum. Real life is not one person talking to themselves. That real life happens essentially in a chavruta, and in this world today where nobody really wants to listen to another person, they really actually feel like they want to listen to themselves all the time. So important for us to talk amongst teachers and amongst students and really think about how constructive conflict, constructive controversy can be a part of one's life. Chavruta and machloket that go along with it is that's not just a Jewish value, it's a 21st century value. The ability to collaborate, to not live in a vacuum, that's something that all of our students are going to need today, tomorrow, and in their jobs in 20 years. So I'm so pleased to be able to share the goals of this webinar. First of all, our first goal is to really introduce this concept of constructive controversy, which was essentially a concept that one can say comes out of the procedures of the ancient Sanhedrin. We really want to introduce that, and we want to familiarize you with this so that you can guide your students, in this type of constructive controversy activities, using a mock Sanhedrin type technique. And of course, we want to encourage you to implement this methodology with your students and think about the Mahloket Matters campaign, participate in it, and share the results of your school's engagement with it on our keep or cancel voting form. So that is what is going to happen here tonight, and I am happy to turn the stage over to Joan Vanderwall, Director of the Pardes Rodef Shalom Schools Program.
Thank you, Aviva. I'm Joan. As Aviva said, I direct the Pardes Rodef Shalom Schools Program. It's a unique middle school project that develops constructive conflict engagement and resolution skills via the study of traditional Jewish texts. We help Jewish schools equip members of the school community to be skillful problem solvers, active in the prevention of bullying, and committed to bringing more shalom to the world. Being able to use disagreement as a tool to resolve problems while building community is integral to our program. Engaging in Mahloket L'Shem Shamayim, in constructive, respectful disagreement in order to arrive at best decisions, is not only vital within our Jewish tradition, but is also vital to sustain democracies. In 1997, a task force of the American Political Science Association, APSA, faulted civic education at the time. Quote, "All too often, it seems unable to counter the belief that in politics, one either wins or loses, and to win means getting everything at once now. The sense that politics can always bring another day, another chance to be heard, to persuade, and perhaps to gain part of one wants is lost." In the last decade, we have seen divisiveness and challenges to civil disagreement play out in political, academic, and social life in the US and other countries. Daniel, could you please move to the slide that shows the quote from Jonathan Sachs? As Rabbi Sachs noted in his Covenant and Conversation teaching on Shmot, a safe space is not one in which dissenting views are silenced. To have academic freedom, we must have the ability to both articulate and respect and hear opposing views. If we as educators want to live in a society that has citizens capable of supporting and participating in democracy, it is important to educate students to value, understand, and conduct civil disagreement. Our times and our tradition makes it essential that we and our students learn how to engage effectively in Mahloket L'Shem Shamayim. During this webinar, we will focus on a structured way to engage in disagreement using a Sanhedrin lens and an experiential methodology known as constructive controversy. Because we are people from different institutions at this point, and because there are quite a number of us, during the webinar, I think that we are going to use our chat tool, you can see it on the bottom of the screen, as a means to engage and participate in the webinar. At this point, I would like to turn our program over to Daniel Roth.
So hi, everyone. Thank you, Joan, and thank you, Aviva. So my name is Daniel Roth. I direct our Center for Judaism and Conflict Resolution here at Pardes. And again, the goal of this webinar is to empower teachers to feel confident to be able to not only teach the text, but also run the exercise that we're going to be describing shortly of this constructive controversy. And to consider participating, as Aviva mentioned, within this campaign that's going to be taking place, we'll describe later on. So what is in front of you is the goals, not of this webinar, but the goals of the teacher's guide that you should have been able to see once you've signed up for Mahloket Matters. And the goal of the session that we're encouraging teachers to do with their students is, first of all, text, and then practice. So it's to learn text and theory about how to disagree constructively by studying the procedures of the ancient Sanhedrin, parentheses, meaning the ancient Jewish court, or parliament. It sort of served both functions in one. And second, to practice engaging in constructive disagreement using what we're going to call a mock Sanhedrin exercise. So I want to start with the text. And I should mention that we have if you have not seen it yet, we have a wonderful 8-minute video that kind of takes it through some of these core texts and discussions, and I'm bringing screenshots from the video of how you can use it throughout this webinar. So part one, we're going to start with some of the texts and the theoretical guides of constructive controversy as they are portrayed in the ancient Sanhedrin. And Judaism, we know a lot about the value of Mahloket L'Shem Shamayim, disagreement for the sake of heaven. We talk a lot about Hillel and Shammai, but really the roots of the culture of the Beit Midrash that is relevant to this day, of studying in Chavruta, studying in pairs, learning different interpretations, having a place where we're hearing different opinions. We believe that the roots of that are really in the ancient Sanhedrin, the first time rabbis really gather together and make difficult decisions, sometimes dealing with life and death, sometimes dealing with major political decisions. So there are numerous guidelines that were part of the ancient Sanhedrin that were set up to try to encourage constructive disagreement. And there's a great article that we reference by Eliezer Schnell, social psychologist, who writes about groupthink and different laws that were part of the Sanhedrin that try to encourage or avoid them being stuck in groupthink, especially since the members of the Sanhedrin, all men, very often coming from similar educational backgrounds, similar social status. The risk of them all coming up with the same opinion was very high. And therefore the stakes were high, and they needed to have as much breaks, if you will, to stop, pause, and make sure that they're not just all coming up with the same opinion. So what we've done here is bring four core texts from the Mishnah and from the Talmud that describe these core values, these core guidelines. And then on each of the core guidelines, we try to bring supplementary texts that go into the rationale behind the guideline, either through traditional sources or through this academic study that was done by Professor Schnell. So what I would like to invite us to do is, as I go through each guideline, we'll pause for just a moment and just put into the chat box how you answer the question of what this text is saying and how might this be a guideline for encouraging constructive disagreement. So the first guideline, pretty straightforward, but there's so much wisdom hiding in it, is just how people sit. That it says the Sanhedrin was organized like half a round granary so that each judge could see each judge. So just take a moment and write into the chat box, okay, why might this be a guideline for encouraging constructive disagreement? And then after we solicit a few ideas, I will invite in some of the commentaries to share their wisdom as well. Let's take a moment. Can you see the chat box?
Do you see the chat box? Okay. Open and transparent. The truth is in the center, not personal.
Who said that? Rabbi Chaitin wrote, open and transparent, the truth is in the center, that it's not personal. Lisa, everyone sitting, facing each other, open, nowhere to hide, right? It's beautiful. I'm curious about why it was sent in, why it's a semicircle rather than a whole circle. So let's start from that last comment by Aviva about why it's half circle, not a full circle. I can't draw this right now. If we had a whiteboard, I would draw it out for you. But basically, you have the half a circle. Facing the half circle was generally the disputants. And then behind the disputants were actually the students. So all the students of the members of the Sanhedrin are sitting and watching. And there are actually traditions that if they caught a mistake by their teachers that actually have the responsibility of the vote, they had to stand up and argue with themselves. So there actually is sort of a full circle when you include the students, but the members of the Sanhedrin themselves were in a half a circle. Another comment here, respect for each other's opinion. Body language says a lot, shows that everyone is equal. So it's brilliant, it's beautiful, thank you, these are great. And what I want to do is just invite in, if you can see visually just how they would sit here. Sitting in half a circle, very common cultural way of peacemaking, of coming to decision, of encouraging debate that leads to good problem solving. Here's a picture of the Jirga from the Pushtan region between Afghanistan and Pakistan, that a lot has been written about their problem solving mechanisms, where they're sitting exactly the way the Sanhedrin is, inviting in the disputants. And here, of course, the Senate, great at problem solving. Of course, the circle makes all the difference. Here is just a screenshot of the video, that if people want to use the video, they can stop instead of a source sheet, look at it, and then solicit people's opinions and then move on. I want to bring in just a couple of commentaries. First is Rabbi Yaakov ibn Habib, 16th century Spain, and then exiled to Saloniki, where he writes, like a granary, they would sit in affection and friendship as one community, as a Sanhedrin within which no one was suspicious of the other, which again reflects some of the comments about body language and trust, that they should see one another. This is so that they each should be able to hear the words of the other, and so that they can argue with one another until the proper ruling should come out. And Schnell, in his article also relates to this as a really important element that you find in academic studies about how to avoid groupthink. Also, by making sure that everyone is treated equally and every voice is heard. It's interesting that here at Pardes, our seats are always in a half a circle, like the Sanhedrin. Again, sending the message that the truth is in the center. When I teach in university, the seats are always nailed down to the floor in rows, because God forbid two students should ever actually look at each other and learn something from one another. Sending the message that the truth is only at the front of the room, and not in the conversation. And that's not really good for learning or for problem solving. And what we want to try to do with each of these guidelines that encourage disagreement is bring at least one text that says, actually, disagreement is not so good. Because if everyone agreed that disagreement is good, it wouldn't be true to its value. So I just want to highlight one text, a later version in the Jerusalem Talmud, that says, the Sanhedrin was organized like half a round granary, and the Nasi, that meaning the head of the Sanhedrin, would sit in the middle in order that all will be able to see him and hear his voice. Notice the shift and almost the pushback at the earlier version, that it was so that everyone can see each other. Here, it's so that everyone can see and hear him, because the truth is with him. And sure enough, we know that later in early medieval yeshivot, Gaonic time period, they started sitting in straight lines. And really the conversation became much more of a frontal conversation and not this give and take around half a circle. And, and I think that reflects also just the way we sit in our classrooms. What are we trying to do educationally? How is our classroom set up? What is the dynamic that the teacher is trying to set? And in general, one of the themes that we're going to try to highlight is that creating an ancient Sanhedrin, a mock Sanhedrin, is not just a one-time activity, but it's something that we're trying to bring into the culture of our classrooms, perhaps in every class that we engage our students in. So that's one guideline. Make sure to sit in a manner that everyone can hear and see and learn from each other. Okay? I want to move on to that's an easy one. I want to move on to another one. Capital cases can begin from the judges on the side. Why? What is the significance of starting capital cases on the side? So you're welcome to write in your guess, and why might that be a guideline for encouraging disagreement? Give it a moment. Oops. So Lisa wrote, let people who may feel embarrassed to follow someone more senior a chance, right? They might be shy, they might be intimidated. The junior members should not feel that there is a correct answer, right? If they already hear their teacher say something or someone more senior, who am I going to be to speak up and say something different? These are all great. So just to invite in, again, some of the commentaries. The Tosefta, around the time period of the Mishnah, expands a little bit upon it. And it says, first of all, the monetary cases begin from the greatest judge. So it's not always that they start from the side. There are times that you start from the greatest judge. Capital cases begin from the judges on the side in order that one should not base his opinion upon his teacher master. Just as we said that you should be careful not to just rely on what everyone else is saying. Maimonides expands upon that and says that we learned that with regard to cases involving capital punishment, we do not ask the judge of the highest stature to render judgment first, lest the remainder rely on his opinion and not see themselves as worthy to argue against him. Instead, every judge must state what appears to him according to his own opinion. This would seem like it's the responsibility of the younger or less experienced to not be hesitant to express their opinion, but there are many legal traditions that say it's the responsibility on the greater judge to make sure that he is not silencing those less senior than him. And it really ends up becoming the responsibility of both not be intimidated and not to intimidate those smaller, younger than you. And Schnell once again writes in his article, in sum, not only were the members not persuaded to vote in accord with leaders or some members' position, they were actively encouraged in their independence. And I should mention in parentheses that later on in Jewish law, even monetary cases were encouraged to go according to the side and not go according to the expert. There's a question about why monetary cases would start there. Look, it raises the question of, is it always important to go through this long procedure that everybody's arguing it out, or sometimes are there simpler cases that we can just ask somebody what's the answer? Just look it up, ask the expert, have them tell us. And I think the assumption was that monetary cases, they were a little bit more straightforward, less at stake. Things could always be reverted if we made a mistake. You put somebody to death, you better make a good decision. But again, even in monetary cases, later legal authorities encouraged that it's more favorable to start from the side. And this picture here, we had the youngest student of the Pardes student body with the oldest member of our board engaged as a chavruta when they did the mock Sanhedrin exercise, and it was great of the dynamic of him encouraging her not to be silenced, but to speak up. So second guideline is that the order of speaking should be designed to ensure that all voices are heard and prevent anyone from being intimidated about expressing their honest opinion. I want to move on to the third guideline. And again, these are 4 of numerous guidelines. Okay, there are more. These are get a little bit more perhaps surprising. Rav Kahana said, if the Sanhedrin unanimously finds the accused guilty, he is acquitted. So here we're not in the Mishnah anymore. Here we're in later Talmudic sources. But this is accepted in Jewish law. Okay, and just take a quick moment and write down, what is this text saying, and why might this be a guideline for encouraging disagreement, that if everyone is in agreement that someone is guilty, the person is acquitted. Okay, so Rabbi Chaitin, thank you. If no one can find even one redeeming factor, then there is something wrong in how they are looking at the case, right? Somebody always has a bit of a schut, some kind of merit. Aviva, there's got to be something wrong if everyone agrees. Something fishy is afoot. Thank you. So, fair enough, as you write, right? Maimonides states, when all the judges of a Sanhedrin begin their judgment of a case involving capital punishment and say that the defendant is liable, he is exonerated. There must be some who seek to exonerate him and argue on his behalf, but yet the majority hold him liable. Only then he is executed. Meaning, there's got to be somebody who stands up and argues the other side. And if not, then we're not going to trust the situation. Everyone recognize what this picture is from? Okay, your students probably will not recognize it. So you can show a 2-minute clip of a 1957 movie, 12 Angry Men, which is a great example of the power of one person standing up and arguing the other side. I've seen this actually take place when I've done the constructive controversy exercise, where we'll get almost to the end and one person will disagree, and then everyone else starts thinking, maybe we're in the wrong direction. The very first time I actually did the exercise was with a bunch of 8th graders at a day school in Washington, and everyone went around talking about why it's so important to disagree. And the very last student says, I think it's important not to disagree. I think it's important that we all agree. And it was just this great, funny moment of you realize that you're disagreeing when you say that. Okay. Anyway, add another beautiful source that talks about this merit of having to have somebody who disagrees before exacting judgment. Rabbi Dov Gottlieb of the 18th century writes that for when not even one person arises to oppose the matter with comments and challenging questions and investigation, it is already not possible that the matter will come out and the truth be clarified. For capital punishment is so severe, we are concerned that in such a case, perhaps everyone fell into the same mistaken conception and therefore he is not killed. And here he really is, he's writing this as part of the chapter, his chapter on why it's so important to always engage in disagreement. This picture here on the bottom, again, your students will probably not recognize who these people are, but it's worth in a history lesson. That is Benjamin Disraeli and Otto Bismarck, the two greatest European leaders of the 19th century. And there was a conversation that Bismarck talks about how frustrating it is when members of his parliament sit there arguing with him, and it's a waste of time because he already knows what he wants to do, and just let's get on with our business. And Disraeli turns to him and said, if I didn't have anyone in my parliament who disagreed with me, I would go out and pay people with great sums of money for them to take my points apart. And Bismarck turns to him and says, where did you get such a crazy idea? And Disraeli responds, it's an ancient family tradition. And what I love about this story, myth or fact, is that it's actually told in a book describing the culture of disagreement in Yeshivat Volozhin, in the great yeshiva of Lithuania in the 18th century, in 19th century, encouraging the culture of chavruta, of never learning alone lest we think that we possess the full truth, and encouraging a culture of disagreement and saying, look, even our great politicians who come from Jewish roots understood that, and that's core to Judaism. So and of course the source that disagrees with that, not everyone reads the Talmud that way. The Yad Ramah, well-known 13th century Spanish commentary, reads the Talmud exactly the opposite as Maimonides does. And he says, in this case, when all members of the Sanhedrin agree that the person is liable, since not even one of them has seen any merit in his favor, they will not find any more merit, and it is not beneficial to postpone the execution of the law, that he is guilty. So actually, he rules that if everyone raises their hand and they say that he's guilty, they take him out immediately and put him to death, because why drag it on any longer? No one has any merit to say about him, and therefore we're convinced we've come to absolute truth. So there's actually a very deep philosophical disagreement between this Yad Ramah and Maimonides. That Maimonides is saying if everyone is in agreement, be wary that you're in the wrong direction, and the Yad Ramah is saying then you have reached absolute certainty that you're correct. And Schnell points out that in the U.S. Supreme Court, in U.S. law, that in capital cases, it's only by unanimous jury decision, right, that somebody can someone can be found guilty, as opposed to in the Sanhedrin, where he holds, according to the opinion of Maimonides, that you always have to have one dissenting opinion. So that's a picture of the U.S. Supreme Court, the famous scene from Life of Brian, not necessarily appropriate for your students, but you should know the reference, that you're all individuals. I'm not, okay? So the third guideline is make sure you are not surrounded by only those who agree with you, which is true not only in the classroom, it's true on our social media, it's true in our communities. It's really one of the greatest contributions to groupthink that I think is plaguing our communities and creating deeper entrenchment and tribalism. So the fourth and final guideline, before we move on to the practical component, is who gets to sit on the Sanhedrin. What are some of the qualifications? There are numerous qualifications. People had to know a lot of different languages. They had to come from a certain type of family background. But one of the qualifications, according to Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rav, where he says, none is to be given a seat on the Sanhedrin unless he is able to prove the cleanliness or the purity of a reptile from biblical texts. A reptile, okay, doesn't only have to be that. It's anything that is totally what we would say treif, not kosher, impure. By definition, it's by the Bible something that is unclean. Everyone knows that. But you couldn't sit on the Sanhedrin unless if you could prove that is pure or kosher. Why is that important? Why would that be a qualification for being able to sit on the Sanhedrin? So we'll just take a moment, and you can once again join us in chat. So Rabbi Chaitin wrote, to be able to see things that are different from the accepted view. I mean, if you ask anybody in 5th grade and you show them that picture, they'll say impure. Everybody knows that. It's consensus thinking. And if you're stuck in consensus thinking that you have the text telling you what's true instead of interpreting the particular situation, you don't have the right to sit on the Sanhedrin. Lisa, knowing background, having in-depth knowledge, it reflects on all aspects of a person. Being able to Google something does not mean you can understand it or even thought about it. And again, another comment here, the ability to think critically, right? So don't, just because it looks like a fact, be careful, right? Make sure to think out of the box and think at it in a different, perhaps against consensus thinking. And I'll just fill in perhaps my favorite legend that speaks to how do they do this. Tells that Rabbi Meir used to know how to argue the purity of a reptile using 49 reasons to say it's pure and 49 reasons to say it's impure, based upon the beautiful legend that when Moses went up to Sinai and asked for a clear-cut Torah, God said, I'm not giving you a clear-cut Torah, I'm giving you a Torah full of ambiguities. Argue it out 49 ways one way, 49 is another way, and go according to the majority. Which is just such a powerful call for critical thinking, for understanding the ambiguities of text and the ambiguities of life. And this text here on the bottom, that's the continuation, the Midrash says that even young students knew how to do that. Or we should say even young students have to know how to do that. Because if students are not trained to think in this type of critical manner, don't expect your leaders to be able to understand contradictory truth and then make good decisions in a proper problem-solving mode. But of course, there are texts that are going to disagree with that. And the Babylonian Talmud says we actually don't hold according to Rabbi Meir in the law, because he was so good at arguing both sides that we never understood actually what he held. As Rashi writes, they were not able to understand which of his words were correct and which of his words were not correct, for he would not give a reasonable, he gave a reasonable and logical argument on what was not the law, just as he did what was the law. So is it a problem that we become so good at arguing both sides? If a politician can stand up and argue both the Democratic position and a Republican position at the same time, does that weaken him or strengthen him? It's a question. It's a picture of my Rosh Hashiva of beloved memory, Aaron Lichtenstein, who was the absolute best in the world at being able to argue both sides and teach his students to be critical thinkers. But it wasn't always 100% clear what exactly he held, and therefore he wasn't a posek halacha. He didn't rule on halacha. He taught people how to think and make good judgment for themselves. So the fourth guideline is make sure each member really knows how to argue both sides on an issue before voting. So all those put together, okay, of how we're sitting, who we encourage to speak up first, making sure that we don't all vote the same way, and making sure that each of us take the responsibility to understand both sides are all part of the many guidelines that want to encourage critical thinking, disagreement, learning conversations, and push against group thought. I want to now transition to theoretical, practical components that doesn't come from Jewish sources, but comes from more social psychology. And this is called the constructive controversy exercise, AKA a mock Sanhedrin, because really the way scholars, in particular two that I want to mention and we refer you to their article that that's up online, David and Roger Johnson, that write about this concept of constructive controversy. What they describe is exactly what the Sanhedrin used to function, is exactly the way a healthy democracy is supposed to work. And in their article, Civil Political Discourse in a Democracy, the Contribution of Psychology, it's just a great description of the forefathers of the US democracy, how they valued constructive controversy, being able to argue both sides, and all the way down to how we educate our kids today in schools. It's a wonderful article that I recommend. And this is the process that we're basing the activity upon, which is that you start off with one position, you hear an opposing position, you begin to doubt your own position a little bit more when you hear the opposing side. You switch sides, you start arguing the other side, and then together you think of creative solutions. And the Johnson brothers, and they've proven this over numerous studies over the years, basically claim that we go through this process of critical thinking and problem solving, the decisions made are so incredibly more grounded and keep relationships so much more healthy than when it's just consensus, when it's just one person forcing their opinion upon others and others kind of giving in, or debate where one side wins, the other side loses. So this is the activity that we're going to be encouraging, and we just want to introduce you to some of the theoretical information about it. We're doing this as part of a larger campaign that's starting now and going all the way till the 9th of Av in July. We have an adult scenario called Keeper Counts as a Controversial Speaker, which you can check out. It's probably more appropriate for high school, okay? But I want to now turn it over to my colleague Joan to describe the materials that we produced for middle school.
Thank you, Daniel. As Daniel said, there are 3 different constructive controversies, and I think that 2 of them, the keep or cancel the school tzedakah policy, are both appropriate. There's one that is specifically geared to middle school, and that's the one that we're going to be going through today because it deals with a collective bar bat mitzvah tzedakah fund, which a number of Jewish day schools and Hebrew schools have. The other deals with a high school tzedakah, a Tikkun Olam club that has its tzedakah fund. So I think that what we need to bear in mind is how we created these and how we go through using them. As Daniel mentioned, a constructive controversy, what it does, it provides a structure in which people have to hear and present both sides of an issue, as well as recognize multiple differing ideas and perspectives before attempting to make a recommendation on how to solve a problem. So why did we choose these things why did we choose the constructive controversy scenarios that we chose? We looked at characteristics and what needs to be included in a robust constructive controversy. One characteristic is that it has to be, well, we'll go through this more in time, but I want to stop for this for a minute. And let's start with the process. So the first process, just as Daniel did for setting the webinar, was we introduce what the issue is. We start with sources. I'm not going to teach of each of these sources, but you can see that we have a source from Tanakh that will help give participants in the constructive controversy an understanding of how we gain our values about setting priorities in giving tzedakah. We then bring in interpreters. You see text B where it's getting very specific about how do we decide if there's multiple needs among multiple people, who do we give to first? Daniel, do you want to keep going? Finally, go back to text C, please. You see that it then goes from the poor of, somebody else comments on the relatives. If you have a poor person who has a relative, that they receive priority of one's household over the poor of one city, the poor of one city over the poor of another city. Keep going to text D. But the Pitrei Tshuva brings in a very important part, that those who take precedence only get first, but they do not entirely push off one's responsibility to give to others. In this case scenario that we're going to be studying, and there are going to be slides that show it, you can also download it from the 9 Adar website. Kids in a school need to decide, kids in a grade need to decide whether to keep or change the school's policy. For 20 years, the school's policy has been that monies that are contributed to the B'nai Mitzvah Tzedakah Fund are to go to local nonprofits only, with the rationale that they want kids to be able to do on-site research, and they want kids to also be able to volunteer in these organizations. This year, there's been a challenge to that issue because of really terrible things that happened worldwide this past year. If you remember, there were multiple hurricanes, severe earthquakes, and suddenly the 8th grade, which is the time when the tzedakah begins to get distributed, they are arguing the policy, and it becomes a whole hullabaloo in the school. So here's the background. Daniel, go down next, please, to the scene. And keep going. So the 8th grade has now been asked to make a recommendation to the head of the school as to what to do about this policy. Should they be allowed to expand it and give to national and international organizations, even if they cannot volunteer in those places? Well, let's take a look at what makes this a robust scenario. Next slide, please. In order to have a good constructive controversy, we have to make sure that students find that there is relevance to the scenario. They need to be able to project themselves into the scene. It has to in some way connect to their lives. Also, initially, the case has to be binary. There has to be a specific dilemma having two clear sides that are personified by a group or an individual stance. It's really important that both sides be reasonable. In other words, each side has to make sense to the people participating and has to be able to be perceived as possibly correct. Each side has to be compelling. When working with adolescents, and probably with adults too, there's got to be some kind of stress or drama that keeps them engaged. Now, having seen all of this, Daniel, if you could go back to some of go back to the texts for a minute. If one side of the argument wants the policy of the school to remain the same, and if one side of the 8th grade wants the head of school to change the policy, to expand it, how do these texts speak to their arguments? Does anybody have some ideas they'd like to put in? Can these texts be read in a way that supports one side, the other side, both? Particularly take a look at the Pitrei Tshuva, I think it was, which I think was text D or C. Okay, Lisa, thank you. Text B can support keeping money in the community. I think text D actually does begin to expand the question of saying, yes, each side has a relevant point, but here's something else that we need to look at. So it can serve to expand thinking. Yep. Okay, thank you, Rabbi Chaitin, for also saying that text B can support the claim to keep it local, but text D can support to move some of it out of the community. Let's continue on. please go back to the compelling part, the slides on that, after we've read the scene. Okay, so one of the things that when we developed these scenarios, we wanted to make sure that there was potential for multiple nuanced resolutions, because though it starts as a binary dilemma initially, we want the scenario to have the potential for the people engaged in it to come up with more creative resolutions and recommendations. We also made sure to bring to our case study pertinent Jewish and contemporary text sources so that the participants can cite them for support in their argument. And most important, we use a structured protocol. A protocol is something that has set constraints on time, specific steps, and stages. In our case studies, in our constructive controversies, the stages include learning of textual material, seeking to understand the dilemma, articulating one side of the disagreement, hearing and summarizing the other side's perspective, switching sides, developing and proposing the best solution to the problem, as well as time for reflection following the discussion, and voting, coming up with a decision within the Sanhedrin structure. I think it's important to recognize that through use of protocols in medicine, science, emergency responses, and yes, even in professional development, it's been proven over and over again that decisions are better after going through each step of this process than those decisions arrived at when skipping steps. Why do you think that is? Please take a moment to give me some of your ideas on that. Okay, it's a little silent. So I'm just going to propose that I think when you have a protocol, it forces us to use our best thinking means. It forces us to actually closely analyze things, look at things very closely, and yet go step by step, knowing that we're not just doing this on the spur of the moment, or it's not just intuition, but since we all are part of the protocol and are going through the steps, we can arrive at the best solution. I think that sometimes when we just rely on ourselves and our gut feelings and thinking, well, let's do it this way, we might miss something. And I think, thank you, the protocols give people a chance to reflect, look at the bigger picture, not rush, and giving everything the time and attention it deserves. So actually, our teacher's guide, which we're about to look at more closely for this specific constructive controversy, does provide a protocol. And it lays out exactly what we're going to do. In the first step, we introduced the process and we introduced the actual case scenario, and we studied text. We then divide students into Batei Midrash, and it would probably be fun for them to give each Beit Midrash a name, and into study pairs. That's the first step of the protocol of the process. The next step, that's the second step. The third step is within Chavrutot, every Chavruta prepares their argument to argue either side A or side B. Like Chavruta A would argue side A, Chavruta B would argue side B. You give them a specific amount of time, and it's important that they know the amount of time in advance. We then move to step 4. Next slide. In which the two Chavrutot actually engage in Mahloket L'Shem Shemayim. And each side not only presents their own side, but they also have to paraphrase after hearing the other side's arguments and make sure that they've heard it as thoroughly and correctly as they can. Now comes the surprise. We haven't let kids know in advance that they're going to switch, and probably I like to not tell them in advance because it makes them a little bit more passionate about their initial position. But then once we switch, we do the same thing. They have to prepare to argue the exact opposite of the side they were on before, given the same amount of time. Step 6, once again, they engage in Mahloket L'Shem Shamayim. In step 7,
Notice that I switched the direction of the pictures.
very cute,
Very
thank
hard on
you. I like that. Step 7, Daniel. Now together, both of the Chavrutot begin to prepare their Beit Midrash proposal. This is where they begin to come up with a third option or a fourth option. And what ends up happening is they often begin to see that the original binary positions were not the most robust solutions to the problem. And they begin to come and say, well, maybe we can keep the policy for tzedakah partially, but expand it by doing X, Y, and Z. Or maybe we need to reject the policy, restate it, but keep some of the initial values that policy was designed to produce. Once they've prepared the Beit Midrash, they then present to the entire Sanhedrin. And generally, it takes about 10 minutes if you have, depending on the number of groups that you have. I think you would give it more time if you had more Batei Midrash. And I think what's very, very important at the end is to allow time to reflect on what happened. Any questions about the process and about setting it up? Oh, I wanted to add one more thing. That once you're in the Sanhedrin, they do have to vote on a decision of what their recommendation would be to the head of the school. It's very important, if you're doing it, that somehow people record either on paper, on whiteboards, or on their devices what the vote was, what the decision is. And when we say report back, reflect on how the whole process felt. What we'd like you to also do, if you do this in school, is report back to us at Pardes and to the Mahloket Matters campaign on how the vote went. And Daniel is now showing us the keep or cancel voting form. Any questions on the process? I just want to add that if you would prefer in your school to engage in this kind of constructive controversy, you can use the guidelines that we use that are the characteristics of a good constructive controversy, what needs to be included. Please use them to develop your own if you want to apply it to other scenes, other classes, other opportunities. And I would now like to turn, if there aren't specific questions, I'd like to turn this over to Daniel to bring our webinar to summation.
Thank you, Joan. So just to say one more point about the voting process is that it's important that people don't have to vote according to their party, according to their Beit Midrash. They vote according to their conscience after having gone through the whole process. And they also don't know about that until the very end. And part of the way they vote is that everyone states how they vote to keep or cancel the policy and one line why they voted that way. And sometimes if people want to change their vote afterwards, they're welcome to, because the conversation is still going on until the very, very end. And part of the rationale we want people submitting their votes is that not just that we can follow what people are doing, but also so that we create a much larger classroom, that it's not just each classroom on its own, but it's an opportunity for different schools and different communities to learn from one another and see how did a different community rule on the same issue? Were there points that they took into account that we didn't? And that's part of the culture that we're really trying to bring, both in our classroom, to our schools, the culture of the Sanhedrin and constructive disagreement, also to the U.S. and to Israel and beyond. And I hope that it's not just something that happens over this one particular experience, but I hope that it helps create, as I alluded to earlier, our classrooms being cultures like Mock Sanhedrin. I just started my course here at Pardes with doing this activity as the first session. For the first time I've ever started with this as the first session of the semester. And it set a tone that this classroom is going to always be looking at each other like members of the Sanhedrin, really looking, hearing, learning from one another, and creating a culture of constructive communication and disagreement. And hopefully through that, we'll be able to learn how to disagree for the sake of heaven and for the sake of our democracy. So thank you so much for joining us. Good luck, and we look forward to being in touch and supporting.
Oh, and Daniel, can I put in one more word, please?
Yes, please.
Okay. From the pragmatic piece, I just also want to point out to those of you in schools that this is not something that can be done in a standard 45 or even 60-minute period. If this is something you want to do in school, I would say that you have to allot at least 90 minutes to it in a school. You could do it over one session or two, but just make sure to allot adequate amount of time.
And again, we write in the teacher's guide about how you could use the video to have less time using text, or you could spend a lot of time using text, right? So there's a certain flexibility, and again, happy to support. So good luck. Thank you so much. Have a good day and good evening.